The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Huw, Rich and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hello everyone, you're back. Well, we had rave reviews after our last podcast, so hopefully you enjoyed it. I love that. There's a little bit of self-congratulation there. I thought it went okay as a kickoff. Anyway, so as promised, this particular podcast we're going to be talking about GDPR and general legislation around, I guess, privacy and how it affects the development process. But I suppose that also includes some of the California legislation, which in effect drives most of the US legislation over that side of the pond and then makes its way across the rest of the states, I suppose. So I'm just going to say a big hello to Tom Pryce, who I've known for a very long time, and we've worked together actually on quite a lot of GDPR stuff. We've done quite a lot of presentations on it. So Tom is going to, I guess, chit-chat a little bit, introduce himself, and then kind of pile on into the joys of GDPR and how it affects companies and what the legislation says and what's actually happening in the real world. I suppose that's really kind of the thing that most people are interested in, and how risky can they get? How close to the wind can you sail? And how it's evolving and how people are changing their practices, I suppose. So what do you reckon, Tom?
Fantastic. Yeah, no, thanks for being here. Great to be joining. So as Huw mentions, Tom Pryce, Communication Manager at Curiosity. Been working with Huw since about 2014, which is nearly as old as the GDPR itself, right? That was first proposed in 2012, so we were quite quick on the scene, really, in researching and putting out content and thinking around the GDPR. I mean, your first question there is, what is the GDPR? I suspect probably everybody watching has heard of the GDPR, read about it. If not, you would have certainly seen its effects, right? Anytime you've had to click accept cookies on a web page, that was an instant impact of the GDPR. Those emails you would have got in your inbox as we approached May 25th, 2018, that was the implementation date of the GDPR, when companies were desperately asking you to give the affirmative for marketing information. That was them getting ready for the GDPR, right? So the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It was proposed by the EU in 2012, and it had a few goals. One was they wanted to unify regulation across the bloc, right? Previously, different nation states had their own, so directives or regulations. The UK had the Data Protection Act, other countries had different legislation. They wanted to unify it. They also wanted to strengthen the legislation to respond to sort of changes in technology and approaches since. You think the UK's Data Protection Act was from the 90s. Think about everything that happened between the 90s and 2012 with marketing, data collection, digitalisation. It was completely not fit for purpose by 2012, right? And the other one was they wanted to make people more aware of how their data is being used and to give them greater control. So it was proposed in 2012. So I say Huw and I started looking at it really in 2014. Then it was brought into law. It was actually ratified in 2016, and there was a 2-year implementation period. Now, you might think people spent those 2 years really getting ready for it, but actually what happened is, exactly, 2018 came around and nobody was prepared. And there's been
I think the general comment was, well, let's see what's happened. We don't want to be bleeding edge. We want to be at the back of the queue here.
Exactly.
And then everyone rushed to the back of the queue.
Exactly. That's right. People didn't really get ready, and I think there were broadly two types of responses which delayed people's getting ready, right? And I call them the gambler and the skeptic, right? So the gambler sort of sat down and said they're only going to fine people if there is a data breach. So it's not going to happen to us because we're not going to have a data breach. It's only going to hit companies that have a breach. And whilst there's been some truth in that, we've seen two things happen. One, data breaches have really gone on the increase. And two, we've actually seen fines that haven't been associated with the data breach. So you think about H&M, I maybe shouldn't name companies, but H&M were pinged for, their employees noticed they were getting spied on. GDPR breach. It was one of the biggest fines.
If it's in the
public domain.
Yeah. That I think was the second biggest fine ever at the time, right? It wasn't associated with the data breach, right? Now the gambler sort of took a gamble. Doesn't look like it's paying off for a lot of companies. The skeptic basically said, this is too stringent, it's not going to stick around. The legislation is going to go away. The lobbyists are going to be all over this and they're going to make it go away. Now, actually, if you look at global legislation, Huw, you mentioned the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, but there's plenty of others out there, right? You know, in Brazil, you've got the LGPD, Canada have new legislation, Chile, India, all over the world. The GDPR is really, it's not a blip. It's set a trend that we've seen in global legislation. So some, like in Brazil, was modelled directly on the GDPR. In the UK, because of a certain event that we won't talk about, we now also have our...
Yes, we will talk about it. The catastrophic event, which is known as Brexit. is... and now we have our own GDPR, which is a cut and paste version. And Britain basically is kind of terrified that if they deviate from it, then they're really in trouble because they won't be able to, in effect, sell into Europe, which they can't do anymore because of the wonders of the non-tariff barriers,
exactly.
etc. Anyway, that's me. That's my final and only rant on Brexit. I promise for the future of all of these podcasts.
There we go.
But
perfect. So, I mean, but what this legislation says is that, you know, these patterns in regulation and law aren't going to go away. So around the world now, you know, there are increased fines for non-compliance. There are requirements to report data breaches. Citizens have the right to ask their data to be erased or the right to request a copy of it so they can move providers, for instance. And this is a global phenomena that's not going away. If anything, actually, the legislation is getting tighter. So there's, for instance, Schrems 2, which is a newer piece of legislation which additionally restricts the movement of data from the European Economic Area to the US. So the skeptic was wrong because the legislation is not going away. The gambler was wrong because there has been a lot of fines. There have been some very big fines. So the GDPR and generally compliance, it's not just the EU GDPR, is something we're going to have to comply with now and in future. So what does it mean for organisations and what does it mean particularly for software testing and delivery? Well, I'll outline a few elements of the GDPR and then probably we can riff off those a little bit. So I think some of the most significant changes were the grounds for legitimate data processing. So you have to have a legal grounds to process data. That means storing data and it also means using them. Now there are 6 grounds. They include things like to fulfill a legal contract in the interest of national security. Those probably aren't really going to apply to testing. The ones where companies I think are most going to look is either they've got consent from the data subject to use their data. Now consent was really tightened. Previously you could have pre-ticked boxes and really wishy-washy definitions of consent. Now it must be an affirmative action and it must be very tightly defined. It has to be explicit and it has to be affirmative. So consent's one area, and the other area people tend to look is for the fulfillment of a service or what's known as legitimate interest. It's in your interest to use your data in that way or to fulfill a service. So you have to have grounds to process people's data. So what's the problem with that? If you're using data in testing and development, you're going to need to know why you're using it and for what purpose. Now it gets more complicated than that. You also need to know who's using it and for how long they've been using it, and that they're not using more data than they need to fulfill that purpose. So these are the principles of data minimization. Don't use more data than you need, and don't use it for longer than you need, and process limitation. Data minimization and process limitation. Only use it for the reason for which you have legitimate grounds. So suddenly you now need to know that you've got legitimate grounds to use data across your testing and development. You need to know who's using it, for what purpose, and how long they've been using it. Okay, that's already hard. And then we throw in 2 other new pieces, right? The right to data erasure and the right to be forgotten, and the right to data portability. Right to data erasure, I can write to a company that possesses my data and I can say they must delete it, all of it, every instance. And the GDPR actually uses the words without delay. You don't get a grace period, it's got to be gone. Portability, you can ask for it in a format that is accessible to you. So suddenly you've got to serve every instance of a person's data in a format that they can access and potentially use it also to switch provider or something similar to that. I think those, that's not the whole of the GDPR, but those pieces of legislation and those requirements throw a massive spanner in the works for anybody who doesn't understand their data. They might have data stored on local machines. They have no way of linking the use of data to the actual purpose. They're using, as much data as they can, full-size copies, even though you might actually only need to run 10 test cases, so why use a million rows? And furthermore, you can't automatically find and delete your data. So what are you going to do? You're going to go hunt for people's data manually? You both know better than I how complex the IT estates are and how hard it is to find, to delete, to ensure, to link the use of data to process. I think it threw a massive spanner in the works. and people haven't truly come up with a solution since then. And so then you ask the question, and then I'll stop after this, how risky can you be? So I think there's on the one hand, there's a difference between following the law in spirit and to the letter. And if you're following it to the letter, you can probably take a few more risks because you can get maybe some legal people involved and they can spin arguments. If you're following it in spirit, you probably can't be very risky at all, right? And I'm not going to advise people either way. We're certainly not giving legal advice on this podcast. That should be stated. But the other area, in terms of risk, there are possibly some grey areas you can hide in, right? Do you have legitimate grounds to process that data? Well, actually, yes, they gave us that data to fulfill a service, testing and development, future-proofing the service. It's all it's all necessary to fulfill that one service. Okay, there's maybe a bit of a debate to be had there, but then there are things which are pretty black and white, and they're not sort of grey area matters. So if somebody asks,
sorry, Tom, can I just interrupt you
Sure.
there? So if, for example, which I have done. I have written to companies and said, I do not want you to use my data at all in any form in development. If one single person does that to every single company in the world, that would then do what?
So in that instance, if those companies did continue using that person's data, so what you've done there is you've opted out. You've withdrawn your consent. So that if they use your data, they would have to show they have a legitimate grounds for using it in that way. And if you've removed consent, they can't fall back on that. If you furthermore exercised your right to data erasure, they should have also deleted your data.
No, it's more the explicit of saying, I do not want you to use this for development purposes, development or testing purposes, which is a very specific use, because there's a general cover-all here in saying that we're using it to improve systems. But that's fine. But by doing some data analysis, that's fine. But I do not want you to use it in the development.
I would say the company wouldn't then have grounds to use it unless they can argue it's in the interest of national security or for the enforcement of the law or something like that. They really ought not use that data. Now the challenge they're going to have is they probably don't even know where the data is and how it's being used to then.
That was kind of why I was teeing
exactly
that question up, to be honest.
Exactly. So this is it, right? With the legitimate grounds for processing, maybe there's some debate that can occasionally be had, but then there are these sort of very black and white. If somebody withdraws their consent or asks for their data to be deleted, you don't really have an argument. They're exercising a right which is written into the GDPR. I mean, other things involved, if you want to share your data with third parties, you're meant to name those third parties and tell the person that you're sharing the data and get their consent for them to share it, right? Now think about offshoring and outsourcing, and everything that surrounds sort of software testing and development. How often do you receive an email to say, oh, by the way, we've got a new partner with whom we're sharing our test data? It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen at all. So whilst there are some areas where it's a bit more grey and you can hide in the grey areas, there are some pretty black and white instances where you can't argue against it. And I think the right to erasure, the withdrawal of consent are two very good examples of that.
I was going to have two questions. The second one is going to be very loaded.
Okay.
So the first one, how in the scenario by which Hugh's example, someone's written in and asks for them not to be used specifically for testing, how would an organisation typically demonstrate that has been fulfilled?
It's a very good question. I mean, so the GDPR mandated the creation of national data protection agencies, DPAs, and they do have the right to audit practically without notice. So I suspect they all go about it a little bit differently. The question is, it's almost like how do you prove something doesn't exist? You have to go through every instance of it, right? So you might argue there, well, actually that's kind of interesting. You can maybe say we'll just, if there's one person's data, how are they going to find it? So our IT systems are so shambolic, we can't even find it. That's probably a pretty high risk strategy. It only takes one email to get sent to that person by accident, or one data breach reveals that person was still in your IT system and you've sort of been exposed there, even if you never get audited, right? And I'm sure we've all opted out of marketing emails and still got those marketing emails still coming through, right? So companies aren't great at deleting data, but I would be down, I think, to the DPAs and the auditors to say whether or not you really have deleted the data. How you prove that something doesn't exist is a very good philosophical question. It could be a podcast in its own right, but it's tricky.
Yeah. You kind of touched on the loaded question in terms of we definitely see many symptoms of not really understanding data flows, data quality, things like that, right? And therefore, in those organizations where they don't have a grip of data full stop, how do they identify that those things have been deleted? Or conversely, if they are in such a state, are they obligated really to go to said regulator and kind of fess up?
So in terms of going to the...
We've gone heavy very quickly.
Yeah. In terms of going to the regulator and fessing up, absolutely, if there's been a breach, absolutely. There's mandatory reporting. There's time frames for reporting a breach. You have to go to the regulator if there's been a breach. If you're not following the regulations, I don't think any requirement to report it, and I don't think a company's ever going to do that, really.
But I would assume it's in their interest, though, to start a conversation, right? Because I'm assuming if you wait until there's a breach, it's kind of a bit like playing Russian roulette, right?
Yeah.
It's like talking to the VAT.
Yeah.
If you let them know up front, they're actually reasonably good at
that. Well, no, it is true. And actually, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, the ICO, who takes care of the UK GDPR, they are pretty good at making the point that they're not going to try and go after companies to punish them. What their role is to help companies improve, right? And there are helplines for small and medium enterprises, and they do a lot in that space. But I mean, I guess, to think about your first question of what can companies do when their IT estate is that poor, I mean, really, it's a shame that 2016, when the sort of GDPR was brought into law, wasn't taken as more of sort of a call to arms to try fix some of these issues in the 2-year grace period you had is one thing. An area where we're seeing a lot of interest now, and it's within testing, it's also coming from outside of testing, with data science and data for training your AI and your machine learning models, is in sort of trying to reduce the attack surface through synthetic data, reducing the spread of data to lower level environments and outside of production.
Before we get into that one a little bit, because I just want to kind of stick on the legal side of it for a little bit. Now, there's another little grey area, which is a great big grey area as far as I can see, and that's the ERPs. So, a lot of companies now, probably, I don't know, anywhere between 10 to 90% of their system is sitting in an ERP. Now, whenever we meet with the companies and we say, well, they say, oh, it's in, Joe Block's ERP system, and we say, well, do you have the right to erasure? Can you tell where the person's system? And they say, well, I say, why don't you contact the ERP vendor? The ERP vendor will immediately say, well, that's the customer's responsibility. So there's this vast gap sitting in the middle. And then when it comes to applying patches and upgrades, which is a major issue for anyone who has an ERP, some great stories there. It takes 6 months to do an upgrade, and they release quarterly. That sort of type of thing. So, and a lot of them is they try and set up separate environments. Now, those separate environments generally are sort of full copies of production data, where you have technical people in there. You might have consultants in there. You might outsource it, etc. Some of them will say, "Oh yeah, we've written scripts to anonymize the data."
Yes.
Now, I'll talk about that kind of as the next bit of this. But if you can just talk about that grey area about who holds the responsibility there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, there's a few things to unpack there. I mean, in general, anybody who's processing a data subject's data, by data subject, there's any sort of person within and even outside of the EU, right? The scope of jurisdiction is quite wide. Anybody who processes it has responsibility. So if you're a third party and you receive the data, you have some specific requirements. You have to tell that person within 30 days you've got the data, give them the option to opt out, let them know why you're going to use it, right? So there's the data subject and the data processor. Any company or individual, but let's consider the companies who receives that data, they become a data processor. Now, I think people use some pretty reasonable workarounds. They onboard people into their companies, they can become subcontractors, they work within their IT systems, and that's where I think you could maybe argue, okay, giving them access within your network on premise, that's maybe reasonable. Sending it to a third party company outside of that, I think then they do become the data processor, and they're going to have to comply with the full force of the GDPR, and they really should technically tell somebody within 30 days that they've got their data. It can't be assumed or implied.
Now, I'm kind of more talking about, to be honest, the ERP providers are doing a truly shocking job. They absolutely didn't care.
Yep.
And I have seen no, in my mind, you should be pushing your ERP solution provider to basically say, I need these features in this product as a matter of urgency. They will do the minimum. They will try and send out some woolly legal words to say it's nothing to do with us, gov. They chuck it over the fence and say, over to you to sort it out.
Yep.
Now, if you think about, let's use something like a healthcare system. Okay. Now, if you say, well, we're going to do an upgrade on your healthcare system, now in the production environment, you've got all sorts of people who have all sorts of different levels of clearance to be able to see certain things about certain people. Now, if you chuck it over into the developers world where you're testing maybe, we've got different layers of security coming now. So I, as a developer or a tester, can go in and I want to play around with those, which then gives me access to data that I should absolutely not have information on. So, if you come in and you say, I want to make sure I can test that a particular date picks up the right set of people. So I put a date in using production data, and I play around with security. I found out all of the women that have had, particular gynecological procedures, etc., which is entirely private, and is horrendous that information would be given out in that organisation. So if you go down to the nitty gritty of just saying, they've been onboarded, I really don't think that's good enough, because they need to be onboarded as a senior manager. They need to be every single level of all that would then give them the different levels of access into that system.
Yep.
So the concept of doing that is just truly, truly horrible.
So there's nuance there. So I think I was trying to answer the first question about sort of which organisations would have to comply with regard to that data. Assuming somebody's onboarded and they can be considered part of an organisation, you still have to comply with all the requirements about, do you have a legitimate purpose for using the data in that way, who you share it with, for how long, and the type of data you've mentioned there, health data, it's got its own special category within the GDPR. There are certain types of data which are sort of considered highly sensitive, relates to union membership, sexuality, health, race. There's a whole range of data for which you have to be even more robust. So I think the problem you've said there, Huw, it's not who needs to comply by the GDPR, it's that company probably is not complying with the GDPR by giving out that data into non-production environments. It's a hard argument to make for sharing that category of data for testing. Just saying we need data to test, I don't think it's going to cut the mustard there, right? Because of the nature of the data, as you say, how horrendous it is getting shared. So in that instance, I think showing compliance would be a very, very tough job. And yet, as you know and as we know, it's shocking how often you can identify this data in non-production, right?
Just to come back on what you're saying in terms of the type of data, where does legitimate interest come? That's fuzzy in itself, right? And therefore, I'm familiar with conduct risk in financial services, right? And at what point does the fact that we don't understand our systems and it could go wrong outweigh the fact that I'm using this category of sensitive data?
Yeah.
Where do the two kind of meet? It'll come above or below each other.
So, I should probably add a caveat on legitimate interest, which is it's a term that's been sort of misused and misapplied, and actually legitimate interest was sort of bundled in there under pressure. In my view, this is sort of apocryphal, maybe not 100% accurate, but in my view it was under pressure from businesses saying, how are we going to sell our stuff? How are we going to market our stuff? And there was a bit of a tug of war, and I think legitimate interest came in as the most flexible grounds for processing data, because it is. But if you actually look at it, it shouldn't be used for, it should only really be used in sort of business settings. It shouldn't be used for personal data that's not that. So if it's in my world of marketing, we can potentially use legitimate interest to send an email to somebody, a marketing email if they've used a business email at curiosity.software. If the same person is using their Gmail, or they're a sole trader, self-employed, or part of a small partnership, we shouldn't use legitimate interest. So there we probably have to fall back on consent. So legitimate interest was taken, and you saw this used widely, people who sell lists of contacts for marketing, or conferences where you say if you sponsor you'll get the whole list of leads. It was used as this great sort of, okay, fantastic, we can carry on as before because it's all legitimate interest, isn't it, really? All of it. It's in our interest, it's in their interest, but actually it's far more limited in scope than what companies have tried to use. And your second question, sorry, that wasn't even your question. Your second question.
So it kind of fed on
Sure.
in terms of where does it come, especially from in an IT context, right, where conduct risk, financial services, system migrations are an obvious one, right? There's some very recent kind of very in the news examples of migrations that have gone wrong, right? And legitimate interest stroke conduct risk would say we need to use copies of live data because we don't understand our systems, or we don't understand the flows between system A and system B. We know we've got some erroneous data in there. The only way that we can successfully do this migration is to use that live data.
Sure.
Where would that rank into, you're kind of then weighing up, it could go wrong versus I can't use it?
I would say if you actually truly were put under the microscope there, let's say it does go wrong, that would probably come in the category of, well, you've explained to us why you did it that way, but you've not justified it, and you've certainly not excused it. So I can give you a good example. In June 2021, and this example got me super excited, really vindicated a lot of what we've been saying for a long time. There was a fine levied against the Norwegian Confederation of Sport. The migration to the cloud had gone, well, the migration hadn't gone wrong, but there was a vulnerability when they were testing the cloud solution, and data got leaked on the sports people in Norway. Now, it was really interesting seeing how the Norwegian DPA, the Data Protection Authority, described why they were fining the Confederation of Sport. And they said they didn't have legitimate basis for using that data. They breached data minimization, so they were using way too much data for their testing. But then furthermore, they said it could have either been completed using using synthetic data or far less production data. So they would have been well aware of the challenges in using less production data, only as much as you need, or in synthetically generating the data. But that wasn't the point. That's the problem with whoever wants to be doing that migration and testing it. That's not really the responsibility of the GDPR or the DPA to enforce it. So they were pretty robust there and pretty rigorous. And I would say, as we discussed earlier, minimizing your attack surface is the most effective way, because then you're reducing the risk as much as possible, and you're simplifying everything you need to do to comply. We've come several times back around to sort of understanding your data, and that is the biggest challenge, but it's not an excuse for not complying with the rules.
I think we're kind of verging into yes, it's a data problem, but you're getting into the effectiveness of the risk regime within organizations, right? And how good are they of understanding the risks, understanding why they happen, and if necessary, going out and talking to the right people to make sure that they understand why they're doing what they're doing, right?
We're going to come back to this. I think what Tom has done is kind of almost teed up some of the core problems here. And I mean, I did a presentation at Eurostar on this, and it was the most highly attended presentation. And I was like, why are you all here? I want there to be no one in this room, basically, virtually every single person was using, well, not everything, maybe about 70% of the people in the room, when they put their hands up, said that they were using production data in development. And then some of the comments afterwards, well, it's really the only way to test. You were arrogant. You didn't understand how development works. You didn't understand the real world works. And there was a definite sort of almost visceral pushback from a lot of people here. And I was trying to explain about what are you actually trying to test? You're trying to test the requirements, which maybe we'll talk about sort of next week. But coming back to kind of the responsibility thing, because I think you said the word risk there. So what we're finding now with some projects is that basically a project manager, senior, whatever the hell they are, they're a middle manager, they're under pressure to deliver. And they are now making critical decisions way down low in the organization. They're making a reference for an exemption to a weak internal police force, or whatever you want to call it, or legal counsel, or whatever it is. And then they're just going ahead. And there's very, very little oversight. And the problem is that it's almost, it's happening all over the place in all the different projects. And it's happening, we're going to do, suddenly pre-prod becomes QA1, QA2 to dev, So it's sort of moving around. So it's completely fragmented across organizations. Management, senior management, whether you call them gamblers or risk takers, they are so driven by just trying to get the job done that there's not really anyone in the organization. So that, and it's extraordinary. People just, we sort of progressing along, creating all this lovely synthetic data. The testing's going, we find loads of bugs, and you come in the following day, and it's all been kicked out, and they've just taken a copy of production data. They've masked the last name, and they say we're done.
To go on to that, we've not spoken a bit about sort of the idea of masking in GDPR, which to make one point around that, because it does speak the GDPR about pseudo-anonymisation, which is a horrible word to say and spell, but broadly equates to masking. But what the GDPR says there, and is interesting, is it can only be considered pseudo-anonymised if you can't reverse engineer and identify data subjects from it. So they set the bar really high, really, really high, and that includes cross-referencing it with publicly available information, with information you've got available from other sources. So the bar for masking it, to your point there, Huw, just changing the surname isn't going to cut it. And the amount of information you're going to have to change starts taking you into levels of understanding your data where I think you've made the argument before, it almost becomes easier then to generate it and just really remove the risk, which is an argument people are increasingly making today, I think, as well.
Yeah,
probably going to open up a new avenue.
Why don't you open it up for next week so you can put yourself as talking points?
So where I was going to go with that, and bearing in mind we'll talk about this next week, is around even when you're creating synthetic versions of things, right? At what point do you postcode's the obvious one, or card numbers that need to validate, for example, right? At what point can you pseudo-anonymize, mask, create synthetic, but still be able to test certain things? And the whole, what do we mean by live data or production data? The whole combinations of what does it mean to be a customer? What does it even mean to mask but still have realistic data? I think is a rabbit hole in itself, and possibly next half hour's worth of conversation.
Yeah. No, there's more than half an hour. I mean, we're talking about coverage. We're talking about what is testing. There's a vast thing. I mean, I would finish on kind of an optimistic note in that, in my many years of doing this, the place that I was most impressed with, I think it was it may have changed, but I'll give them a pat on the back on it. I think it was the Bank of India I went to see, and what they'd done is they created basically a sort of another bank, like a little mini bank, which they had fully staffed, with a tiny number of members. They had each role was covered, and they basically were putting in. Every single day they came in and do their processing. They do their end of day processing. They would basically pretend that they were, a fake bank, and it was actually a really great place because it's like a playground. You can kind of go in there. People from the teams could come down and go into that and understand. For example, if you've got some new features coming out, you could go down and work on it in the little fake bank. They were the people that were running it. Were the people who were kind of the best, the most knowledgeable users, the ones that have worked with the system for so long. They kind of know where all the bodies are buried, literally. And it was just a great system. I mean, basically, that's all they cared about was because they could take the data out of that system easily because it was fake data. They created fake customers. They they used real addresses, but but they weren't really. Everything else beyond that address or the postcode was completely separate. So as long as you just have something there which says don't send an actual physical mail out, which has happened, and there's some great stories. I think Richard Branson got. I think he once got something to say that his account had been cancelled. I think that was a classic on Christmas Day, I do believe. Anyway, but I mean, they set it up, and if you think in terms of the cost of running a bank, having this tiny little mini bank inside of it brought so many benefits and actually pretty much cleaned up a lot of this kind of problems in that, getting that development data down in there. And I would also say, just to finish on a less optimistic note, I think on my very first day working for an insurance company, as soon as I got access to the back-end database, it was select star from salary order by descending. And I got everyone's salaries in order, and I mean, that's kind of what people are going to do, and then you don't run it 6 months later to see what people's salaries have gone up by, so, if you said that to anyone in management, they'd actually take this seriously, but they are just not taking it seriously. I mean, and that is it's just not good enough. Final thoughts, Rich?
We've got so much more to talk about.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom. You are a legend as ever.
Thanks very much.
We'll pick up some of these and maybe just dive down into how people can improve, I guess, is really where we're going to finish. Right. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And
cheers all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Why Didn't You Test That podcast. Thanks for listening. Show notes via the link.